And I suppose the first question is, why do we want to study and model minerals processing systems? From my perspective, of course, it's because they're really interesting and challenging problems to actually tackle. But I don't think Mark wants us to just study things that are fun and interesting. There must be somebody willing to sponsor this work. And so the main reason that minerals processing is such a hot topic, I suppose, in terms of the challenges in it, is because of, first of all, the massive increase in the demand for metals over the last number of years. I'm using copper as an example, and approximately 90% of all the copper ever mined was mined in the last 100 years. So froth flotation is a way of separating minerals you want from the minerals you don't want, and do it based on hydrophobicity. So you basically do it based on how water wetting the particles are. So if you have some particles that are hydrophilic, so want to stay within a water phase, and other particles that are hydrophobic, so don't like to be water wet, if you bubble air through a mixture of those, the particles that are hydrophobic will stick to the air bubbles, and the particles that are hydrophilic won't stick to the air bubbles, and so you can carry the particles you want to the surface of the froth and therefore recover them. So the flotation process itself occurs conventionally in a flotation cell, and these flotation cells have two parts to them. They have the bottom section, which is mixed. You have an impeller at the bottom, so very rapidly spinning impeller, and it's actually along the shaft of that impeller that you're introducing the air. So the air comes down that shaft, gets broken up into fine bubbles in the impeller, or between the impeller and stator. And then you have a relatively well-mixed zone at the bottom, which is where all your particles that you want end up becoming attached to the surface of these bubbles. My work has particularly focused on the froth phase, and that's because it might not sound at first glance that the froth phase is that important a bit of it. It's transporting the particles over the top, but it plays a really, really important role in the purity of the product you get. If you're pulling material out the top of one of these cells, you're pulling water over with the material, so the stuff comes over with water, and the things that are in the water are there non-selectively. This means that the water just pulls over a random selection of what's actually in the pulp, and the problem is the pulp contains 99% stuff you want, and maybe 99% stuff you don't want, and maybe 1% stuff you do want, which means that stuff that's pulled over non-selectively will pretty much all be stuff you don't want. And therefore, the important job of the froth is to reject water. And that is typically controlled, or it's indirectly controlled, by the size of the bubbles. The bigger the bubbles, the drier the froth, the lower the liquid content, and so the higher the grade you pull over. How to predict them and how to model them. So I'm going to first talk a little bit about the foam structure. So foams, there are three main structural elements you have in a foam. The thing you see most clearly in any foam or froth are the lamellae or films between the bubbles. These films will always meet at the sort of corners, as it were, in sets of 3, and then these corner lines, which are known as plateau borders, will meet in sets of 4 at a junction called a vertex. The other thing you can do is carry out structural simulations of these systems. I'm not going to go into the details of this, but foams are minimum surface area structures. What they try to do, the main energy in them is a surface energy. They try to minimize their surface energy, and so you end up being able to simulate their structure and shape. Problem with this is, of course, you can only simulate maybe 1,000 bubbles in this sort of detail, whereas a flotation froth might contain 1 billion bubbles. So you're many orders of magnitude off being able to directly simulate a flotation froth this way. But there are some useful things we can start to study from this. In flotation, the main way people control flotation cells is to actually look at the top surface. So you have a skilled operator who can look at the top surface of the froth, and knowing from the froth structure and the particle loading on the surface how well the cell is actually operating, and so can adjust the parameters that way. This means that because skilled operators can do it, there's a lot of research into machine vision for doing exactly the same thing. And so it's important to know what is the relationship between what you actually see at the top surface and what's happening underneath. So we do these structural simulations like that. And we can also do them of bursting and coalescing, sort of more unstable froths. And you try and make a model for that. And therefore, we need for our froth models for three different things. We need the models for the gas behavior, we need the model for the liquid behavior, and we need a model for the solid behavior inside our flotation froth. So, in terms of the gas motion, we actually assume that it's incompressible, which might seem a very strange assumption for air, but liquid content of flotation froths are comparatively low, and they flow comparatively slowly, which means that sort of compressible effects actually aren't that important, and including them, that would make the models much, much nastier. We also tend to assume that they're irrotational, which again is a slightly strange one from anybody who knows about rheology. Irrotational implies that, well, typically that's in viscid flow, that you don't have any viscous effects, but we still get quite a good approximation, even though there's very strange rheologies in these systems, and that's because there's a lot of slip at the walls. So these froths actually slip along the walls. They aren't pinned at the walls, and so the internal rheological effects actually don't make a giant difference to the behavior. And so the most important parameters for predicting the gas behavior are the shape of the flotation cell it's actually in and the stability of the bubbles. In particular, how much of the air is bursting at the top surface of the froth relative to how much is actually overflowing. And so we actually characterize this by something called an air recovery, which is just the fraction of air you put into your cell that actually ends up coming over the lip. Peak in the air recovery. As you increase the air rate, the air recovery increases and then decreases. This wasn't actually expected behavior. You'd expect it to sort of either monotonically increase or sort of asymptote to a value, but it does actually go through a maximum on pretty much every plant that it was measured at, and this maximum corresponds to a maximum in performance. So the next part of what we need to look at is how the liquid moves. So we know how the gas is moving, but we need to predict the liquid motion. And there are three main forces acting on liquid. There's gravity, there's viscous dissipation, so basically your bubbles are moving upwards and your liquid's draining down relative to your bubbles, and so there's a drag force between your liquid and your bubbles. And then there's capillary suction. Basically, I told you about the plateau borders being curved, and so the pressure difference between what's in the bubble and what's in the plateau border. But the smaller the plateau borders are, the bigger this pressure difference. This means that liquid gets sucked from big plateau borders towards little plateau borders, or more, think of it differently, from areas with high liquid content towards areas with low liquid content. You have relatively uniform liquid contents internally. In fact, the main thing which changes the liquid content over most of the froth is changes in the bubble size. But near the bottom, so near where the froth and the liquid are meeting, there's a very rapid change in liquid content. And there's also rapid liquid changes in any walls that slope outward. So you can see another boundary layer against the right-hand wall. The final thing I needed to add to the models to be able to predict the behavior of a flotation froth is a model for the solid behavior. And there are two main types of solids we need to account for. There are those solids which are attached to the bubbles, and there's hopefully the valuable material, and they'll just move with the bubbles. So you know their velocities, etc., if you know the velocities of the bubbles. The complexity with them is that as you get coalescence and bursting, they become detached. And so you end up effectively dropping particles off the surface of your bubbles and into these plateau borders that you now need to model. Solids, and they enter your froth by entrainment, so they're dragged in by the water, or they come in from this detachment and bursting. And these solids are strongly influenced by the liquid motion, especially the very particles, they'll just follow the liquid, but the slightly larger particles particularly will have a settling velocity relative to the liquid, and they'll also disperse. So there's various mixing and dispersing mechanisms inside a froth, and that will actually spread things out. And that's actually quite important for flotation. The stuff you don't want will disperse upwards into the froth, so dispersion will cause you to collect stuff you don't want, and at the same time it'll cause the stuff you do want, which has been released higher up in the froth, to disperse out of the froth.